Hey everybody, moving into chapter 2, section 4. So on the last one, you should have learned about the Articles of Confederation. Make sure that you know, as a little review, what they could and couldn't do under the Articles of Federal Government. And that one slide that I created from my whiteboard, the states had all the power. Okay, so because of all this stuff, and we talked about Daniel Shays, you should have done your Daniel Shays Q&A. What kind of led to the Constitution and for something to be done? Well, we know Shays Rebellion. There was no federal military. They couldn't stop any state rebellion that was happening at this point in time. Later on, you're going to see after the Constitution is created, the Whiskey Rebellion from Pennsylvania is going to happen, and George Washington is going to enable the military to march in and settle that rebellion. The big thing that kind of happened here after Shays' Rebellion was the Annapolis Convention in 1786. They wanted to meet to discuss trade relations, and only five, like I said in the previous PowerPoint, only five of the 13 states ended up showing up. All the representatives that were there kind of threw their hands up and discussed and said, we have to do something about this. And that's when the idea started to be floated around about the creation of a new constitution, with creating maybe a stronger central government, but protecting us from a tyranny that we've had previously. Kind of the background of the Constitutional Convention. So when we talk about the Constitutional Convention, we're talking about the convention they got together from May to September of 1787 to create the Constitution of the United States of America that we still have today. Not everything is the same, but we still are under today. It's the oldest document that any country has ran under in the world. Okay, examine and recommend changes to the existing articles. And that's what they wanted to do. They knew the articles had failed. So who was there? Who was at this first Constitutional Convention? And unfortunately, it was just wealthy, upper class white men. These people were selected by the state legislators. Okay, so each state, if we watch the Patriot here, each state is going to have their own state legislator, which means there's a group of landowners that get together, mostly white, wealthy, upperclassmen that own land in the state, and they get called to a convention, and they make a decision on what they want from that state. The state representatives then take that to the federal convention, okay, which was the Constitutional Convention at this time. So some guys that were there, it was not a popular vote thing, meaning it wasn't based off of population. It was just these guys were present. They represented their states. George Washington, Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, which you guys know in the famous Hamilton screenwrite and play. James Madison, Roger Sherman, notable names not present. I kind of referred to this. I think I got it wrong in the last PowerPoint, but John Adams was not president, which was interesting. He's the minister to England at this time. And Thomas Jefferson was the minister to France. I don't know why I said Franklin last PowerPoint, but it was these two guys that were gone. That's what was sticking in my mind from that. So the Virginia delegation had a big say in what was going to happen. It was led by a guy by the name of James Madison. Obviously, you know Madison and the Bill of Rights. He had every intention of creating a new constitution. This is Virginia's mission in Philadelphia. They wanted more power. Virginia felt like they deserved it because they were the biggest state. They had the most population. So he created, along with a guy by the name of Edmund Randolph, who's going to present this plan at the Constitutional Convention as the Virginia Plan. So within the Virginia Plan, Edmund Randolph was the governor of Virginia at the time, as you can see here, kind of spun out this idea of three branches of government, where the legislative branch would be the strongest. That's the branch that's like our Congress in current United States of America. We would have two houses. Bicameral means two, and it would only take 50% required to pass legislation. Well, that's kind of what we have now. We would have a strong federal government which could veto state laws, and smaller states objected because they would have no influence. It would just be a two-house system, all based on population, and the smaller states would have so little of representation that they would not be able to do anything or have any say. So why even be there? Might as well get sucked into a big state. The second plan that was proposed in the Constitutional Convention was the New Jersey Plan. It was proposed by William Patterson, who was a delegate from New Jersey. And he basically just wanted to change a couple things and create some changes in the Articles of Confederation. There would be one house, and they would create an executive, a court system. There would be taxes for the federal government and federal regulation on trade instead of states, but would require a unanimous vote to pass these taxes and trade regulations. Well, we know how that failed previously with the Articles of Confederation, so that was kind of bad. Larger states obviously objected because how could they have equal power than us when they don't even have anywhere near the type of people that we have in our states? The Virginia plan became seen as a centrist plan. New Jersey was a glorified Articles of Confederation. It was just going to keep happening, and we saw this central kind of point of view for the big states in Virginia. Alexander Hamilton introduced the idea of a constitutional monarchy. Everybody freaked out over this because monarchy being said in the same sentence with America is just not going to happen at this point in time. We were so scared of that. Far more conservative than the Virginia plan. This was calculated to help Virginia, but it didn't until a guy by the name of Roger Sherman comes along, and he is the architect for the plan that we currently have in our system today, and it's known as the Great Compromise or Connecticut Compromise. So we would have a legislature where the lower house was popularly elected, and this is currently what our House of Representatives is. We have 435 members in our House, plus 3 from Washington, D.C., which is 438 total. Then they assign delegates based on population. So depending on where you lived in the lower house, depend on how much representation you're going to have, just like we do now. The upper house would have equal representation from each state, and this would be known as the Senate. And they were elected by state legislators at this time. So there would be 2 per state. So at this point in time, there would be 26. We currently have 100 because we have 50 states. So we have an upper house and we have a lower house. Lower house based on population, all right, depending on how many representatives go, depends on how many people live in your state. The upper house, 2 per state is equal. There, it's a great compromise, okay? There would only need to be 50% of the vote to pass legislation in both of the plans. And this is the model that we have now in our current legislator in Congress. We have a lower house with 438 members. That is Congress, or not Congress, that is the House of Reps. And then we have the Senate in the upper house based off equal representation, 2 per state. We have 100. That means there's 538 total votes for the President of the United States. And that is known as our electoral college, 538 votes. Okay, like I explained in class for those of you that came. So the Great Compromise is going to be the structure of how our system is going to work with passing bills and laws. You're going to need 50% passed in each house, okay, the upper and the lower house. It would then be sent to the president. The president would have to sign it. And it wasn't until a little later after did the Judiciary Act come into play with our court system being the third check and balance in the system. So we have 3 checks and balances. For a bill to become a law, it has to pass 50% in both houses. The president has to sign it. If the president vetoes it back to the House of Reps, then you need 66%. 66%. It passes the president, and then the courts always have to make sure that it's constitutional, and that's their job. The other thing that was a big problem at this point in time in the creation of the Constitution was the issue of slavery, and it's going to lead, as we know it, to the Civil War in the 1860s. And the framers built slavery into the fabric of our government. However, they are careful to never use the term slavery in the Constitution. They do 2 things for slaves during this time. Number 1, that's passed in the Constitution is known as the 3/5 Compromise. Make sure that you know that. 3/5 of the slave population would count as a vote towards the president and taxation. And number 2, the Slave Trade and Commerce Clause. If slaves are imported into the United States, there is a massive tax on each slave. They discussed that, number 2, the northern states at this time said, we don't want, the South wanted each slave to be counted as one. Well, the South has slavery, and you said, well, I thought they wanted to keep them down. I thought they wanted to repress the slaves at this point in time. The South wanted the slaves to vote, okay, because they knew that they weren't educated at this point in time, and they knew that they could use them to get who they wanted in office, okay, because they would make them vote for whoever they wanted. Therefore, Okay, it was a good thing for the South in order to have slaves to do this. So the North said, no, we're not going to do that. But if you want them to be counted, we're going to count them as 3/5 of a person. Okay, so 3/5 of the slave population would count as a vote towards the president and taxation. All right, so the South kind of had uh, an edge when it came to voting and electing representatives here. All right, and the North said, if we're going to count 3/5 of a slave as a vote, you have to promise that this won't be discussed for 20 years, from 1788, the creation of the Constitution in 1788, until 1808. Okay, this will not be discussed. So for 20 years, the Slave Trade and Commerce Clause was put in there. And for 20 years, slavery would not be discussed. Okay? Now, if they're imported in, the North said we are going to heavily tax them to try to keep the slaves out. Okay? These items would pose big problems for those trying to remove slavery in the future. So that these two problems ended up being big issues. Some differences just in general between the Articles of Confederation and Constitution, and you can see here. Simple majority in the Constitution, easier to change things, get things done, get bills and laws passed. AOC, 2/3. In the executive branch, Constitution, we're going to have a single president. Not a lot of power at first, but eventually we're going to get stronger with our next PowerPoint when we talk about the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. No executive in the AFC. Power of the federal government, Constitution, potentially could be very strong. Okay, because we're taxing, we're doing all these different things. We have a military now. Articles of Confederation, almost non-existent, very weak. The amendment process for a change in the Constitution, we need 2/3 of both houses of Congress, or if we have a state convention where the states convene, 3/4 of state conventions have to approve it. Articles of Confederation need 13 of the 13 states to approve it. Virtually impossible, unanimous vote. We know how crazy it is to even get 13 people that were in my class the other day just to agree on a social consensus on whether there should be experimentation on animals or not. Okay, so think about that. The Constitution is a less democratic document, takes power away from common voters, more aristocratic, creates a stronger federal government, and these are kind of the things against the Constitution. And this is a major danger in the eyes of many people that if we have a stronger central government, then it's going to turn into we're getting taxed now. And if we're getting taxed, that's going to lead to a repressive government and a leader that's not going to respect us like King George III. Ratification process. So for a change to happen, if 2/3 of the states ratify, the Constitution would go into effect. Every state had to go through the ratification process and approve it, hold a state convention, and elect delegates to the convention. This sets up two groups at this point in time, and we're going to talk about this as our next PowerPoint. And as these state conventions are happening, two political parties start to be formed. People that are for a stronger central government, which are known as the Federalists, and people that are against a stronger central government and more power for the state governments, which are anti-Federalists, or their other name for the political party is the Democratic Republicans. We're going to call them anti-Federalists because I don't want to confuse you guys. Okay, Jefferson is going to lead the anti-Federalists, and a guy by the name of Alexander Hamilton is going to lead the Federalists. In the ratification process of the states, the Constitution was drafted and signed by 39 of the delegates on September 17, 1787. Some states were very pro-Constitution and they ratified easily. All right, from December, almost a year and a month, we see this happening. Okay, I'm sorry, a month. All right, it would be a month because the new year starts. So from December of 1787 to January of 1788, a month, we see a lot of these states ratify it quick. Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut. Other states follow later on from February to June 1788. Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire. The final group of four that we see. So why was 9 of the 13 states were required insufficient? We need all though, right? So because we didn't get all, we needed all in order for this to pass. We see the Federalists start to make a strong push to write things. Okay, and I'm almost done here. This is the last slide. So these papers started to come out, and they were anonymous papers. Okay, written by Adams. Franklin wrote a couple, and Hamilton wrote some. Okay, Madison and John Jay wrote them. And they're basically to get support for the Constitution, okay? Two important Federalist papers in their printed newspaper, How to Create a Strong Government While Preserving Freedom, and the separation of powers and checks and balances. Hey guys, that's it for today. Great job. If you have any questions, shoot me a message through Schoology.